Alright guys, what's up? I'm Swanky Games, and today I'm going to attempt to teach you guys how to understand frame data. Frame data is a very, very big part of Tekken. Some people would argue that frame data is Tekken. It's also very important in most every fighting game, especially if you're trying to become competitive. Frame data is probably the single most important thing to note. It's also very important when you're trying to improve on your character. Some time ago, I posted a video about how to go about learning a character, and this would be kind of like not really a part 2, but more like a 1.5 follow-up to that, as this is something to start looking into after about 100 to 200 matches. This would be something to start having in the back of your mind about. Basically, it's something to start keeping in mind. So if you guys consider this to be useful or helpful, or you guys just end up enjoying it in general, consider liking and subscribing. The more that you do, the more it gets my videos out there, and I can ultimately help more people, and it will motivate me to do more of these videos. Also, if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a member. I do have my Discord up. It's a very, very awesome community full of players that are eager to learn and eager to play Tekken. So if you guys are trying to find a more hands-on community to improve, or you just want a casual way of getting in some GGs whenever you hop on, consider joining the community. It's very, very awesome. I'll be putting the link in the description down below. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and kind of get things going. This isn't necessarily gonna help you guys to fully understand what frame data in particularly is. The idea here is to really try to get you guys to understand maybe like the concept of it, so that you guys can start working with the numbers a little bit. Keep in mind that if when something is plus or blue, keep in mind I'm on the left side, so this would be to the bottom left there. If something is plus or blue, this means that it is still technically your turn. And if you look at the bottom right where it says -1 and it is red, that means it is technically no longer your turn. If something is -1 to -9, it is no longer your turn technically, but you are inherently safe. Which means that if your opponent were to do their fastest move, which is usually a 10 frame jab, you're gonna be able to block or duck or whatever before they can get to you. If something is +1 or more, this means if you were to do a move and then another move, and if your opponent tried to challenge it, you should be able to beat them in that situation. If something is -10 to -14, these moves are usually minor punishable. With a few exceptions, there are some exceptions. This basically means that you might get a minor punish, or depending on the situation, you could get wall splat comboed, you could get thrown onto the ground. Grabs are all -12, so I think a punish grab is harder to break than a normal grab, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that, and so on. And then generally, -15 or worse means that it is launch punishable, which means that you can be thrown into the air and comboed for using that move, which we will get into more details about here in a little bit. When something puts you at plus, for example, 2 1-frame jabs, right? The first jab is typically gonna leave you at +1, okay? So you'll see that at the bottom right, Huang is left at +1. So if I try to do my fastest move, which again is gonna be about 10 frames, and again, there is exceptions to this. We're not gonna get into all the details, but for the most part, if I were to try to throw out a jab between his first jab and his second jab, he should be able to beat me in that exchange, for example. As you can see, every single time I try to throw out a jab, it gets beat. This is where being at plus has its advantage. Now, then if I do a move that puts me at -1, this means that if I were to try to do a jab, my jab should be able to beat their fastest attack because they're actually at minus, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. So as you guys can see in the first exchange, the Horong to the right was able to get out his second jab before the one to the left. But in the second one, the one on the left was able to win that exchange. So that's something to start kind of getting the concept of if you don't know much about frame data. But then there are unique situations where you get put in neutral. This would be plus or minus 0. This means that if I were to throw in an attack and it leaves me at neutral, that's what it would be considered as neutral, or 0. Then if we both were to throw out our fastest move, that they should both actually trade, or they should basically hit each other. For example, as you can see, we both struck each other because our move came out at the exact same time. So that's something to keep in mind. So, and a lot of times people will look at a neutral situation as being a little bit more of an advantageous situation due to the fact that most people can't react quite so quickly, and most people don't know the frame data like that. So it's worth noting when something like that is in fact the case. All right, so first let's talk about what it means when something is punishable. So as I mentioned earlier, anything that is -10 or less, so -11, -12, and so on, these are all moves that would be considered punishable, with a few exceptions with like pushback or certain situations. For the most part, if something is -10 or puts you at -10, you are punishable. So, for example, if I have Horong do his up 4-3 plus 4-4, you'll see that it left him at -10, right? This means that my jab would be considered a punish. For example, you can see down there in that little box where it says clean, counter, punish, wall, the punish lights up to represent that we did in fact get a punish. Like so. Some characters get really good 10 frame punishes. Other characters like Horong don't get the greatest, but they at least you get something. Something that is -10 is not usually the worst thing that can happen unless you're up against somebody that does have a very good 10 frame punish. For example, you don't want to do something that's -10 while your back's to the wall against a Mishima. More particularly Devil Jin and Kazuya specifically. Because their 10 frame punish is designed to be able to wall splat you if it does connect on hit. When you basically give them that 10 frame punish for free, if you're not careful, they can essentially get a full counter hit or punish launch on you for putting yourself at -10. Another example would be Lee's forward 2-1. It's actually a -10 move that's a mid-high, but because it has so much pushback, unless their back's to the wall, they're not going to get a punish for it. So there are certain exceptions of that nature. But then there are moves like Horong's back 3 that are -15 or worse. In this case, Horong's back 3 is -19, which means just about anything I can do could potentially launch. For example, down forward 2, I can match his back 3 with my own back 3, and so on and so on. I can get a full launch and get good combo damage, just for throwing out the wrong move at the wrong time. So you want to be very, very careful with these. Again, sometimes it's worth YOLOing it and seeing what happens. Sometimes you'd be surprised. Other times, it's not the smartest idea. Other times, you could find yourself doing a move that's maybe minus 12, put you at minus 12. This is a move that would be where I could get something a little bit more than a jab punish, but I'm not necessarily going to get a down forward 2 launch. As you can see, the punish didn't light up, there's no punish. But if I throw out a 4-3 like so, I get a pretty decent punish overall. Very, very solid. So this is where knowing what risk you're taking when you throw these moves out can really benefit you in the end. These are things to keep in mind when you're doing a move like these that puts you in a punishable situation. So when you're learning your character and labbing them, it's always good to check to make sure that if you see like a really seemingly powerful move, you want to make sure that if it is punishable, how punishable it is, so you know maybe it may not be worth throwing out, every chance you get, whether it be standing or crouching. For example, Hwoarang has this really strong low in the form of down 4-3. It's a fairly solid low. It gets you 27 damage, and there's always that threat of the last attack, and it does pretty good damage. And when you're in heat, it becomes a whole natural thing. Very, very decent low, and it's unseeable, which is even better. The problem is, as you guys saw, it's very punishable at minus 23. So just about anybody can get a punish for it. It's not too difficult. So it's kind of one of those things where you really gotta be careful. But with it being a low, it might be a little bit more tempting to throw it out than, say, a mid or a high that would be punishable, because your opponent has to actively duck to block it. But even still, despite how good the move actually is, because of the potential of being blocked and launch punished for it, it's something you would want to be very careful doing. Now let's talk about moves that are still minus, so technically your turn is over, but you're not punishable, which means that afterwards, even my fasted attack can be blocked. For example, if I decide to go and do Hwoarang's down forward 1, again, like I mentioned earlier, this is -1, so I can ultimately block it and be safe, for example. And then if, say, I do something like Hwoarang's forward 2, for example, this is -2, so it's that little bit more. Again, not a whole lot I can do about it. But unfortunately, if I were to try to take the initiative to attack, I would lose that exchange for the most part. There are certain situations where, say, I could potentially do a sidestep. For example, as you guys can see, that even though I'm at that -2, I could sidestep out of the way of any potential danger and keep up the momentum despite the fact that my attack was blocked. There are certain situations where, though I'm safe, doing something like that sidestep probably wouldn't be recommended. For example, Hwoarang's forward 1+2 is -9, so it is still very safe, right? As you can see. However, I'm not going to be able to sidestep out of the way if I do a fast enough attack, which is the point. So I'd say anything that's like -4 or safer would be sidesteppable, where you can keep sidestepping and keep up the pressure. Whereas something that's like -5 probably wouldn't recommend trying to sidestep. But where something is -9, that doesn't necessarily mean that your turn is over. It's supposed to be. But if you've taken the time to, say, learn your opponent's habits, or you have an idea of what most people tend to do after you throw out a forward 1+2, you could potentially do a duck
If you think that they're going to go for like a high, you can try to duck, for example, where you know that they're going to try to go for a high, like, you know, even just the jabs, you know, something of that nature. You could duck and try to keep up the momentum in that manner, for example. So that's something to keep in mind. So it's definitely worth experimenting, and a lot of really good moves. For example, Horlong's down forward 4, his right foot forward, forward 3, and moves alike. They tend to be in the minus frames, but they're still very, very good, because if they do manage to hit, the reward is pretty decent, and there's no risk due to the fact that even on block, they're safe. For example, Horlong's down forward 2 is -7. Has poor range, but if you think your opponent's going to run into you, you just throw it out. And if by the off chance they do block it, you're completely safe. But if it hits, you get a full launch, which is what you're looking for, obviously. So that it would be considered very good. Or another example would be Horlong's JFSR, a very, very big move in Horlong's arsenal. And what's more is at -8, it's completely safe. And this move arguably is one of the best ways to get some bonkers damage when it comes to Horlong's combos. These are big moves that pose very little risk. And, you know, his backlash, his forward 1+2, down forward 4 homing move, right foot forward, forward 3, and so on. These are moves that would be worth throwing out that are completely not punishable. And so when it comes to your character, if you're not a Horlong main, you would want to try to find moves that are like that, where, you know, you get some kind of reward. Even just some small pokes are better sometimes than getting a huge reward, if you think you can get in your opponent's mind. All right, so next let's talk about the neutral. This is when you would maybe throw out an attack that neither gives you frame advantage or disadvantage. This is plus or minus 0, respectively. This is when, for example, if I were to throw out a jab, like so, and my opponent throws out a jab at the same time, because I'm in neutral, they would trade, for example. Why is this a big deal? Well, because this means that at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is who's smarter with that knowledge. So if your opponent knows your character, they might have an idea of how to deal with that neutral. But if not, then you might be able to use that. You might be able to consider that to be frame advantage. Another thing to keep in mind too is, say that you are pretty sure that your opponent knows that the move you're throwing out is neutral, and you think that they're going to try to attack. Well, then you go ahead and throw out a move that essentially either takes your turn back or will interrupt anything that they would try to do with those neutral frames, for example. So that's some stuff to keep in mind. Another example would be this move. Again, it's neutral on block. So if I were to try to do anything, we would trade, correct? However, if I'm, again, this is one of those things where if I'm aware that my opponent's going to try to do something, for example, a high attack, I could use that to my advantage to maybe do something that has a high crush property, which is not something we're going to get into today. But it is definitely something to keep in mind when trying to fish for certain kinds of setups. So when you're going through your character's move list and you see a move that is neutral, whether it be on block or hit, it might be worth looking at a few different types of setups in case your opponent reacts a certain type of way to that attack. All right, and so our last bit is when you actually have frame advantage. This is when you do an attack and you're actually at plus. Not every character has a strong amount of moves that are plus on block. Horong being kind of one of the exceptions, and a couple other exceptions. For the most part, most characters only get a handful of moves that give them plus on block frames, and usually that comes with either a slow startup or extremely linear, or just not the greatest follow-up from it, so on and so on. Again, when you have frame advantage, this means like if I were to throw out a jab, and then if my opponent were to try to throw out a jab as well, my second jab would beat their jab. That's the general idea. Another idea would be something like this that leaves you at +4, which means if I were to do something that's, say, 14 frames to come out, like this, for example, you can see that we still traded. However, if I do something that's, say, 13 frames or faster, then for the most part, because I stayed inside those frames, there's nothing my opponent's going to be able to do. For example, I was able to beat them at their fastest move because they tried to press into me and disrespect my frames. And you can use that to your advantage, because even if, for the most part, people either won't know those frames and they'll attack into you and you'll get free damage, or they will know those frames and then they have a choice to either respect you or not respect you. And if you've proven to them multiple times that you know how to stay inside your frames, then eventually they're probably going to stop trying to challenge that. And then you can start getting away with these bigger stuff because they're hesitating after that. It's a very, very big deal. Another thing to keep in mind is, like, if something is +5 on block, for example, a lot of characters don't get something like this. You know, if your character, say, has a 15 frame launcher, you could essentially try to throw it out like so, and then even if it trades, my opponent still gets launched because they wanted to challenge my plus frames. And even though we traded, it's definitely in my favor because they wanted to attack into me. So you could either try to stay inside of those frames so you can get potentially guaranteed damage, or continue pressuring if they want to keep blocking, or you could try to throw out that down forward too, and either you get lucky and they try to attack into you and you launch them with a trade or not, or they block it and you're still only at -7, you're still safe. You know, so it's one of those things where, you know, if you have that situation where you're starting at plus frames, it's not the worst idea to try to use that to your advantage to really try to pressure your opponent to try to get them to make a mistake or whatever. And this is this is not just with Horong, this is with multiple characters. Another example would be, say I did something like Horong's running 3. This is +6 on block. So if I were to try to throw out a down forward 2, it doesn't even trade. So it's one of those things where your opponent may not want to try to respect your plus frames, but if they don't even get a trade. All they get from that, potentially 70 damage if you're Horong, and depending on what other character you're using, it could be more, it could be less. You know, because they wanted to try to challenge you, you could either get a counter hit launch or a regular launch. So Horong has a counter hit setup that is fairly decent. When he does his backlash, he's at +4, which is really, really good. Unfortunately, he doesn't have enough for a down forward 2 setup, but what he does have is a potential back 4 setup, for example, where he can get pretty decent damage. And because I kept inside of those frames, even if I were to try to throw out a jab, the back 4 would beat it, which is the idea. So it's very, very important to lab stuff like that to see if you can make that stuff happen for you. When you're looking at moves that actually do have plus frames, for example, a lot of running moves tend to have plus frames. For example, it's a very good idea to consider like what you can do as a follow-up. Sometimes it's good to like really stay in those frames just to kind of keep it compact, and sometimes maybe you want to try to do something a little bit bigger, just to really try to get your opponent to open up a little bit, because they might see that once and be like, I feel like I can interrupt that, and then the next time they try to interrupt it, and then they get launched for it. So the stuff like that, like, definitely stuff to keep in mind and to experiment with. But the idea here is the more plus something is, the more you can kind of get away with. You definitely want to try to see if you can find stuff with your character that is like that, and to see if you can maybe take advantage of it. Characters like Horong, they have a bunch of moves that give us plus frames, so it's not too hard for us to find stuff that works. But then characters like Steve or Jack, for example, probably not the best examples, but they don't have a lot of moves that give them plus frames. So the few moves that they do have that do give them plus frames, you really want to try to take advantage of what you can with that, because it doesn't happen for you as often as you would maybe like for it to. But I do believe that is about all I can teach you guys when it comes to frame data and trying to learn to understand it. It's pretty much one of those things where when you're learning your character and you're going through the move list, again, once you make it past, I'd say 1 to 200 matches and you're considering improving with your character, is when I would consider maybe going back through their move list and start looking at the frame data and seeing what benefits you can get out of it, what moves kind of link into each other, what moves are really, really good, which moves you maybe shouldn't abuse as much because you can get punished for, and so on and so on. So these are definitely things that you want to start keeping in mind. And what's really, really good about it is that, say, after that 1 to 200 matches or whatever, you're picking a different character or something of that nature. And if you actually did check the frame data when you were learning that other character, after 1 to 200 matches, you'll have a general idea about their frame data. So when you go up against somebody who's using that character, you may not be like a god at defending against them, but you might recognize a move and be like, oh yeah, that move is punishable, I should do this. Or this move is launch punishable, I should do this. Or after this move, I can sidestep and get out of the way, even on hit, because they're only at so much plus frames. And it's stuff to kind of experiment with. So definitely stuff to keep in mind. With all that out of the way, I do think that's going to be it from me, guys. I really do hope that this helped you guys out a little bit. Again, this is meant to kind of help you with learning how to understand your character a little bit and learning how to understand frame data for the most part. Because honestly, when it comes to any fighting game, frame data can be a really, really big deal, because it's essentially what the game runs off of. Experiment and see what you guys can get away with. But without all that out of the way, I want to thank you guys for joining me. I want to thank you guys for stopping by, and I'll catch you guys in the next video or stream. Take care of yourselves, happy gaming, and peace.